My name is Jonathan Hecht, and I am the Dean of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, Cincinnati campus, the campus here in Clifton. And we are so proud to be one of the partners in convening today's summit. Our next conversation is going to be a very important one. My training in academia was in medieval Jewish history, and from that period, as you've already heard, anti-Semitism was already present, and that's certainly some of the things that we need to consider. It did not start with World War II and with the Nazis. So our next conversation will focus specifically on past and present anti-Semitism in America and beyond. Anti-Semitism was sometimes called the oldest hatred. It's hostility against the presence of the Jewish people and prejudice against the Jewish people. The Nazi Holocaust is history's most extreme example of anti-Semitism. However, it did not begin with Adolf Hitler. Rather, anti-Semitic attitudes date back to ancient times. Hatred for Jews has manifested itself in different ways throughout history. We are living in a time now when anti-Semitism is on the rise both here in America and abroad, where we see it in its classical mode and in more modern iterations, where we see it coming from the right and the left, and where it is being legitimized once again in unexpected ways. Our panel of distinguished experts will examine the factors that motivate this resurgence, where the greatest dangers lie, what's at stake for all minority communities, and what can be done to counteract this threat. To moderate our conversation and to introduce the next speaker, I'd like to welcome to the podium my colleague and partner at Hebrew Union College, Dr. Gary Zola, who is not just a professor on our campus, but also the executive director of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives, and of course he's the Edward N. Ackerman Family Distinguished Professor of the American Jewish Experience and Reformed Jewish History. It's all written out on his card, which is why it's written in very, very tiny letters there. So, Gary, come on up.
Good morning, friends. Of course, you know that in Jewish communal life, the longer the title, the more unimportant you are. So, as you heard from Hecht, anti-Semitism is sometimes called the oldest hatred, and certainly is a remarkable phenomenon in terms of the longevity of the experience. You also heard that we will be having a panel of very distinguished experts who will be examining the factors that have motivated the resurgence of anti-Semitism in our own day. You know, but before we really do that, it's so important to take a few minutes to orient ourselves towards this phenomenon as a historical experience. I know that I am frequently asked by people who want to know the answer to the simple question, why is it that people hate the Jews? Why does this phenomenon linger for so long? What is the reason for it? And to offer us a broad introductory overview, an attempt to at least set this into historical context before we begin with our panel, we are very, very fortunate this morning to have with us a distinguished Jewish historian, Professor Michael A. Meyer. It is really a special honor for me to introduce Dr. Meyer because he is one of my teachers, and I cherish this honor to call him that. I know Dr. Meyer well enough to know that he'll want me not to linger too long on all of his accomplishments. I just want to point out to the audience that Dr. Meyer has been associated with the Hebrew Union College for his entire professional career. He began by teaching at our Los Angeles campus for a few years, from 64 to 67, and then after 67, he's been a teacher here on the Cincinnati campus until he retired, and now holds the distinction of being Professor Emeritus at the Hebrew Union College. Dr. Meyer is a specialist in modern Jewish history and has written hundreds of articles and numerous books. He's so very well known in our Reform Jewish community for having written a volume which is really the standard history of Reform Judaism, both in its European origins and here in America, called Response to Modernity. I could carry on, believe me, for another 2 or 3 or 4 minutes just listing the many titles. I hope there's some of that in your material, but I think good judgment would have me now bring him to the podium so that he can help us to sort of set the stage for our panel discussion. Won't you join me in welcoming Professor Michael Meyer?
Thank you, Gary. If later on you go to visit the exhibit put on by the Holocaust and Humanities Center, very shortly after you enter that exhibit, you will see a very large sign in German which says, "Die Juden sind unser Unglück." The Jews are our misfortune. It is a slogan that became popular in the 1870s when it was stated by a prominent professor of German history by the name of Heinrich von Treitschke, and it was picked up by the Nazis so that every issue of Der Stürmer, the pornographic Nazi newspaper, had that slogan across the bottom of the front page. So what was the link between anti-Semitism and the Holocaust? What are the roots of anti-Semitism? What are the forms of anti-Semitism that in various combinations continue to assault us today? I would suggest there are 4 basic types that often work together. They are religious anti-Semitism, national anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism, and a very special kind of racial anti-Semitism that is Nazism. Let me begin with the religious. It goes all the way back to pagan times, pre-Christianity, when Roman and Greek authors simply could not understand that the Jews believed in a single God and not in many gods, and that this God could not be represented by idols. They made fun of Judaism. They attacked Judaism, as the pagans later would attack early Christianity as well. But then there is the New Testament. For many years, it was believed that the Jews killed Christ. And that became a very important basis for anti-Semitism. Today, we know, almost all scholars agree, that it was not the Jews, but the Romans that were responsible for the death of Christ. But nonetheless, there are passages in the New Testament which over the centuries have made it possible for Christians who desire to attack the Jews to do so on the basis of scriptural text. And let me just give you 2 quick examples. One, Matthew 27, 22 to 25, where Pilate, the Roman emperor, Roman governor, says, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And all the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Interpreted to mean that not only were the Jews at the time of Jesus responsible for his death, but in fact the Jews in killing Jesus, so it was believed, called down a curse for all generations, for Jewish children and grandchildren down to our own time. And a second, John 8:43-44. Jesus is made to say here to the Jews, "Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires." The Jews are children of Satan, as Eric pointed out already this morning. And they were pictured as that all through the Middle Ages. Pictured as devils, as sources of evil. If something catastrophic happened, it must be because the Jews are devilishly behind it. So when the Black Death struck in 1349, what was the reason for it? Nobody knew about germs. It was the Jews who poisoned the wells. Surely that is the reason, because they wanted to destroy so many Christians. And of course, there was the problem that the Jews, in biblical times and at all times, have been a stiff-necked people, a stubborn people. They have refused to convert to another religion. And it was that made the very great Protestant reformer Martin Luther, in his later writings, when it became clear that just as the Catholics had not succeeded in converting the Jews, neither had he succeeded. And therefore, in some of his late writings, he suggests nothing less than to burn Jewish synagogues and Jewish houses. When Hitler came to power, most Christian clergy in Germany waffled and became supporters, or at least they remained silent. Hitler was not a religious Christian by any means, but he could take advantage of Christian attitudes. Yet, there were also Christians in Germany and elsewhere who risked their lives to save Jews, believing that Christianity is about the love for all people. That's the religious source. What about the national source? That comes into existence much later, at the beginning of the 19th century, as nations were being formed, and as Germany sought to pull itself together as a nation against the French. The French had argued universally liberté, égalité, fraternity, humanitarianism that necessarily had to include the Jews. But the Germans now began to say, no, we Germans with our Christian roots are special and different, and the Jews are a different national group. They have their customs and ceremonies. One of the writers said, the Jews are a state within the state. We can't trust them. Xenophobia came into anti-Semitism at that point. And then there is the racial. The racial comes into existence in the latter part of the 19th century, when anthropology and thinking about blood and blood differences comes into discourse. Now it is argued that the Jews are a separate race. In 1881, an anti-Semitic petition was signed by 250,000 Germans, arguing that German Jews should not be considered as equal. Racial anti-Semitism is the cruelest anti-Semitism of all, for there is no escape from it. Religious anti-Semitism you can convert. National anti-Semitism you can try to move from your culture to the majority culture. But if the difference lies in the blood, the difference lies in the race, then there is no escape. And of course, even physical escape in Nazi Germany was very difficult as countries introduced immigration quotas against Jewish refugees. Popular in those days was this jingle, goes like this. Was der Jude glaubt, ist einerlei, in der Rasse liegt die Schweinerei. What the Jew believes doesn't matter. The swinishness lies in the race. And then there's Nazi anti-Semitism. It would be a mistake to say that Hitler's anti-Semitism was the only reason that Hitler came to power. There was a depression in Germany. There was the so-called communist threat at that time. There was unemployment. Hitler promised jobs. But nonetheless, anti-Semitism, given this ideological history in Germany and also in other places in Europe, made it easy to believe that the Jews were pulling the strings, that the Jews were the ones responsible for the Great Depression of the 1930s. Hitler then wanted not simply to expel the Jews from Germany, but utterly to destroy them. That was the original character of Nazi anti-Semitism. It wasn't to get rid of the Jews by getting them out of Germany. It was to get rid of the Jews, period. What is really frightening about Hitler's anti-Semitism, however, is that it was, as scholars have pointed out, a salvationary kind of anti-Semitism. Hitler believed that by destroying the Jews, he was performing a redemptive deed. He was saving humanity from the devil. This powerful fanaticism drove his anti-Semitism. This was surely not a banal hatred. It was a demonic hatred. The Holocaust stands as a warning. To overcome hatred with humanity. Our center is called the Center for Holocaust and Humanity Education. That's what the exhibit downstairs is about. That's what our conference is about. And finally, let me say this. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, in his tract, which really began the Zionist movement of the year 1896, called The State of the Jews, said, quote, "For the longer anti-Semitism lies dormant, the more fiercely will it break out." And that's what seems to be happening in the United States and in the world today. Anti-Semitism, largely dormant since the Holocaust, has shown that it has the ability to emerge from dormancy. I conclude with this. A refugee from the Holocaust, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, a friend of Martin Luther King, speaking just before King's famous speech at the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28, 1963, included these words, and I quote, "When I was a rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under Hitler, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. The great people, which had created a great civilization, had become a people of silent onlookers. They remain silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America, Prince continued, must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent, not merely Black America, but all of America. We are here because we must not remain silent. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Meyer, for helping us to set, if you will, the context for the panel discussion that we'll be now having. I mentioned, for those of you who might be interested, all the Cincinnatians, if you're interested in learning more about Rabbi Prinz, whom Dr. Meyer just quoted, we have at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati the entirety of his collection, including the vocal recording of that famous address. Now we're going to, as promised, we're going to invite two distinguished guests to come forward and be on the stage and really talk about their own work and experiences relating to the unfolding of this increase in anti-Semitism that we're experiencing both here in our country and abroad. And I'm going to introduce them now and then call them to come forward. Before I do, I just want to point out that you were all given cards to ask questions if you have questions. And you might want to keep that in mind, because halfway through the presentation we're going to remind you of that and then try to get to some of the questions towards the end of the session. So I want to first introduce Mr. William Daroff. William Daroff is the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and the Director of the Washington Office of the Jewish Federations of North America. William Daroff is the Chief Lobbyist and the Principal Spokesman on public policy and international affairs for the 148 Jewish federations and more than 300 independent communities, Jewish communities in this country. And it's his job to ensure that the voice of this collective organizational body is an important voice and heard in our nation's capital. William guides the Jewish community's advocacy efforts on the Federation's movement regarding key domestic policy issues. These issues include health and human services for the elderly, homeland security, strengthening charitable organization. And in this capacity, of course, he is a central player in foreign policy circles on issues that relate to the United States and Israel's the relationship between the United States and Israel, and issues in the Middle East. He is a tireless advocate, of course, in this fight against anti-Semitism, fighting forces both on the right and the political left. I also want to welcome Holly Huffnagle, who is serving now as the Assistant Director of the American Jewish Committee in its Los Angeles office. American Jewish Committee, one of the co-sponsors of our event program today. Holly oversees international relations and the office's projects and programs relating to monitoring and combating anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance and discrimination. Now, before going to the office in Los Angeles, Holly served as the policy advisor to the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism at the United States Department of State. She held that position from 2015 to 2017, and from 2010 to 2015, she was a researcher for the Mandel Center of Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Museum and Memorial in Washington, D.C. She's received her master's degree from Georgetown University in Global, International, and Comparative History, focusing on 20th century Polish history, Christian, Jewish, Muslim relations, before, during, and after the Holocaust. And most recently, she was a scholar in residence at Oxford University with the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. And of course, on both of our speakers, both of our panelists, there's more information in your programs. I can say with real pleasure that William Daroff has been to our community here in Cincinnati on numerous occasions, and it's great to welcome him back. But this is Holly's very first visit to the Queen City of the West, so we want to give you a very warm welcome to Cincinnati, Ohio. Join me now. So this part of the panel we're going to do a little more informally and more in a conversation. But actually, before we begin, I thought that maybe I might ask each one of you to take a few minutes and talk in your own words from your own experiences, both what you're doing professionally and, in a sense, how it relates to the problems that we're here together to explore and discuss, giving you a chance to kind of connect your work to the summit.
I can go first. Can everyone hear me? Yes, you can. Well, first off, thank you so much for the warm welcome. This is my first time also in Ohio. I'll be here for about 30 hours. The next time I will come a little bit longer. I did want to say thank you to AJC Cincinnati, JCRC, just for the warm welcome. Everyone has been so friendly to me. I need more of you in Los Angeles. That ate a little better. So, as introduced to me, I worked formally as the special envoy to monitor for that anti-Semitism. My expertise actually is related to the Holocaust history, education, specifically in Poland. But the past 3 or 4 years, I've really been focusing on policy issues surrounding anti-Semitism. So the title of our panel is Antisemitism Then and Now in America and Beyond. I'm the beyond part, and I will mostly focus on Europe and in like 2 minutes I have to share what's happening on the ground there, because outside of Israel, Chicago, 50% or so of the world's Jewish population, outside of the United States, Europe is the next largest Jewish population in the world. And unfortunately, right now we're seeing that that's where many, if not most of the anti-Semitic attacks are happening against Jews, very much threatening the viability of the Jewish community. So, I have a few actually statistics I want to read. I promise you I'm not going to bore you with numbers, but I think it's going to ground us, and I'll share a couple of stories as well. So, since 2012, 15 Jews have been killed in Europe because of anti-Semitism. Just 7 years, past 7 years, we have 15 Jews who have been killed because of anti-Semitism. All this data is in the last 3 months, all reputable sources. Anti-Semitism right now is the biggest problem for Jewish communities in Europe. 85% of, can you hear me okay? Okay. I can shout, I'm a teacher, I feel. I'm an educator. 85% of Jews in Europe say anti-Semitism is the #1 threat they are facing. That's above unemployment. That is above government corruption. That's above transportation issues and all the other things they're facing. 85% of Jews say that anti-Semitism is the #1 problem. In France, 95% of Jews say that's not France. 3 out of 4 Jews have to hide their identity because of fear of anti-Semitism. So they don't wear the kippah on their way to synagogue or to Jewish day school, or they hide their Star of David because they're afraid. 2 out of every 5 Jews have considered emigrating, either from Europe altogether or from the country or into another European country in the last 5 years. This is interesting. It's going to be a topic of conversation we'll have also a little bit later today and then in the breakout session. Every 2nd Jew in Europe in the last year has been blamed for the actions of the Israeli government. 1 out of 2 Jews will face some kind of persecution or attack, even if their family had been in, France in the 10th century or Germany since the 9th century or Poland since the 10th century, because of the actions of the government of the state of Israel. 20%, now this is interesting, and this especially hits home for me as someone who's an educator in the Holocaust. 20% of French people between the ages of 18 and 34, so a very young demographic, don't know anything about the Holocaust, or know very little about it. And we're seeing, unfortunately, the CNN survey that came out a few months ago, we're seeing this actually as a growing trend that less and less, fewer and fewer people know what happened here in Europe. At least 70, 75 years ago. That is very disconcerting. And then one more statistic is, this is also very interesting, is that 89% of Jews believe anti-Semitism has increased over the last 5 years, but only 36% of the general public. So there's this discrepancy between what Jews are feeling and what the general public sees as a problem. So that's a big issue. And then the last thing I'll mention is that 4 out of 5 Jews don't report anti-Semitism. They don't think that it can be done. So you have this kind of resignation attitude. The other thing is that, it's not a big deal. I'm on the street, I'm spit at, or I'm called an expletive word, or I'm told to go back to the gas chambers in Auschwitz. But it takes too much time to report it. So you have this normalization of anti-Semitism. It's becoming normalized in many different aspects of European society, and that's very frightening. So I know you heard earlier today from Deborah Lipstadt, we had an incredible presentation giving the background, the different phases of anti-Semitism. What's happening today in this climate of global economic insecurity, of nationalist movements, of this deep divide, polarization between the left and the right over Israel and relationship to Palestinians, you see this spike, and we're seeing anti-Semitism in different forms, in different phases. They're all happening now. And so it's really complex. And if there's one thing I want everyone to do, only do one thing today. The reason why it's so hard to combat it, why can't we, what are we doing to combat anti-Semitism? Why can't we just, end it? One has been going on for thousands of years, which we've heard, and it's adapting to different circumstances, but it's incredibly complex, and what happens in Chile versus what happens in Malaysia versus what happens in South Africa versus Europe, it's very different. And you almost need experts at that local level to be able to figure out its sources and to be able to confront the problem. So in Europe, we're seeing really from 5 phases. I won't go into detail because we'll get back into the questions later. But we have from the far right, far right parties that are in parliament now. Unthinkable, right, after the Holocaust and after the Nazis. We have Holocaust revisionism, I don't even want to say at best, and then Holocaust denial and distortion at worst. Governments, we're seeing in Central and Eastern Europe even dabbling in this revisionism of the Holocaust. Far left, this used to be the far left's platform of anti-Semitism with mostly global conspiracy theories, Jews with power, banking, etc. Now it's an anti-imperialist agenda, and its target is the state of Israel. That's really what we're seeing. And what's really interesting about the far left is the connection with Islamist ideology, connecting with Islamists on levels of dismantling the nation state of Israel. So even though what we see in Islamism and some of the more extreme elements of it is a very reactionary social movement against women, against LGBTQ rights, the far left, even though they are advocating on platforms of anti-racism and equality, they combine forces when it comes to delegitimizing and demonizing the individual. And unfortunately, the ramifications of that are carried out on many Jews. Not everyone, mostly in Western Europe. You know, in Poland and other places, there are a lot of many of these issues because the population is rapid. So this is very different. And then the last piece, which I'll mention, and it's funny, we talk about the different phases of anti-Semitism, and this one has to do, and in Europe, I guess it's more of an issue than even here, mainstream society. So, and this isn't to say that you get from far left and far right, all these places that don't go outside because it's everywhere, but mainstream society is under the surface. And Deborah looked at in her book, I think everyone can get a copy of this. She has a whole chapter on someone called the dinner party anti-Semite. You know, kind of underneath the surface. What we're seeing though is especially on social media in Europe, this is where the anti-Semitism is coming through, but also in some language. And I was speaking with a security guard in Belgium, and they were saying that the word Jewish in the local Belgian Flemish language, is becoming just to mean bad. So instead of someone like kids on the street saying, oh, you know, is smoking bad for you? Is smoking Jewish for you? And this is the blend, and so we're seeing this, and that's also disturbing. So I'm going to just kind of close my little segment with a story that is a very powerful story because I think it speaks to bigger issues, just anti-Semitism, anti-Jew hatred, but at the values level as well. So, as I mentioned earlier, 95% of Jews in France say that anti-Semitism is the number one problem. And this is, well, one reason is France has the largest Jewish community in Europe, with less than 500,000 Jews. And after the Gaza war in 2014, there was protests all over Europe, of course, but a lot of it was taken out against synagogues and Jewish institutions of Jews as somehow representative of the policies of the government of Israel. And so our office, the Special Envoy's office, we were in Paris, we were meeting with the Jewish community, and we asked, we said, are you thinking of emigrating? There are some trends of Jews leaving and leaving France. And there was a young gentleman, he's part of the French volunteer security police force, who raised his hand. And he said, everybody I know is thinking about leaving. Everybody. Everyone I talk to is asking about leaving. We're going to leave France. But will we do it? Maybe 10%, maybe up to 60,000, 75,000 will leave. But we're going to stay. It's too hard to leave your family, to leave your culture, to leave your language, to leave your friends, to leave everything that you know. We will stay. But why send our child to a Jewish day school when they're the subject of target of terrorism, like in Toulouse? Why send our child to a public school where they're bullied for being Jewish? 1/3 of French Jewish parents today send their children to Catholic schools. 1/3. Because that is the safest place to be a Jewish student. Well, you know, he said, we won't necessarily go to synagogue as much anymore. We'll hide our identity. We're not just assimilate. That's the danger. We'll just simply stop being Jewish. That's the easier thing to do. So the French government has been great, but civil society I don't know about. If civil society doesn't stand up for us, it will fail. But at the end of the day, it's kind of where we close. He's standing up at this point. It's very powerful. At the end of the day, it's not about us. The Jews may be the first to go, but we won't be the last. This is not about us. This is about the very values of the French Republic. And we talk about values today, about America, and about us as a republic, and of the people, for the people, by the people. Can we preserve this? And exactly what we're talking about beyond it.
Before, I just want to make sure it's clear to all the people here, there are a number of special offices that are connected to our State Department. I'm not sure everybody is aware of it. Some of you may be. One, of course, is the Special Envoy or Ambassador for Religious Freedom. One of these special offices. Then there is the office that Holly was speaking about that, I don't know, 25 years old, something like that. I went to Okay. Oh, right. It's relatively recently created the Special Envoy for Antisemitism. Some of you may have heard that there's a little bit of a gap before that person was appointed in the current administration, but now there is an appointment and that ambassador. Maybe we'll have more time in the future to talk about that. But William, in the same sort of fashion, could you share with us a little bit about your perspective and considerable experience you've had in the work you're doing?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Zola, for the introduction and for being here. And I want to thank all of you as well. I want to thank Jackie as she walks out the door and the JCRC team for their amazing work putting this together, and Shep Englander of the Jewish Federation as well. Thank you. It's but more than Jackie and Shep, I want to thank all of you. As I look at this audience, it is not a typical Jewish Federation or JCRC crowd. And it's beautiful and it's wonderful to see folks from every corner of this community here to tackle the scourge that is anti-Semitism. So, as we would say in Hebrew, kol hakavod, well done to each of you for being here. As far as background, probably the most important thing is I am a Clevelander. One round of applause. I'm a Clevelander from the Boomer Esiason era, so I saw the Browns lose many games at the stadium. So congratulations. I don't think I would have been as polite during the era. I am a Clevelander. I was involved in Ohio government, Ohio politics before and after being in Washington, and Gary actually just opened up an interesting door that links Ohio to the office of the Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism in the State Department. I used to work for George Voinovich, of blessed memory, a former Ohio governor and Ohio senator. And in 2003, there were three of us who were having a conversation with then Senator Voinovich about the scourge of anti-Semitism and his fear about nationalism and principally in Central Europe and Eastern Europe coming up and anti-Semitism coming back. Those of you who may recall, Senator Voinovich, he was from Slovenia and Serbia. He had a lot of connectivity to Central Europe and had great connectivity to the Jewish community in Cleveland and statewide, and obviously in Cincinnati as well. And we were brainstorming, and the thing that Senator Voinovich was afraid of was that parts of the State Department would be motivated on things other than anti-Semitism. That the desk that's responsible for Denmark is interested in promoting trade with Denmark, having good news with Denmark, having the U.S. and Denmark sign all sorts of agreements, and papering over whatever sort of differences there were. The same with the desk that covers Lithuania, or the desk that covers South Korea, you name it. The desks are all focused on trying to bring, what the State Department does, diplomacy, trying to bring us together. And so the idea that we had, that Senator Voinovich then took to the late great Tom Lantos of blessed memory, was that there would be an office at the State Department that would be focused primarily and principally on anti-Semitism, to wave the banner of the United States and the support the United States has for combating anti-Semitism, and to ensure that at each desk at the State Department, when they were looking at these treaties, should we sign this fishing agreement with Finland? When they're signing off on whatever it is they have to sign off on, they don't violate trademark rules. They honor their extradition treaties. And among those boxes that they would check was that the government is combating anti-Semitism and doing it in a way that the United States government would be supportive of. And so to bring that to Ohio, to connect what Holly has talked about here, it shows that this is not something that the United States government or even Ohio politicians have just been focusing on in the wake of the last couple of years, but it's something that has been out there for a while as this century has started. The context that was presented by the professor and by Holly, I think, is important to give a sense for the sort of work that I'm engaged in. I am, as Gary said in the immediate introduction, I'm the chief lobbyist for the federation system, for the Jewish federations. Jewish federations are communal bodies in 147 different communities across the continent, and rather than being 147 offices in Washington to promote each individual federation, there's one office, which is the office that I direct. Among the issues we deal with are issues that concern anti-Semitism, and talking with members of Congress, members of the administration about these issues and how we are engaged as a community, and to try to ensure that the government and individuals are focused on the scourge of anti-Semitism and are able to combat it. And the context that we've heard, the historical context, as well as the context in Europe, I think gives good context for we as an American Jewish community are coming from. And perhaps as well for my belief that we should be given a little bit of leeway here as a community, that we should be thought of within this context and given a little bit of leeway ourselves to define what anti-Semitism is to us. That in an environment where we have thousands of years of anti-Semitism, in an environment where me right now walking in the streets of Paris with this yarmulke would put me in danger, and the two of you for walking with me, in that environment, as we as Americans see the confrontations that we have as a Jewish community, whether it is Charlottesville, whether it is Pittsburgh, whether it is utterances from Congresswoman Omar and her defenders, that coming at us from the left and the right, from the north and the south, we're under siege. And it seems to me that the response that we've heard from the comment, and just to give some context, Congresswoman Omar is a freshman Democrat from Minnesota, member of the House of Representatives. She has a history on social media of writing things that are offensive to Jews. During the 2013, she wrote about Jews hypnotizing the American people as being the reason that the American government is supportive of Israel. And this harkens back to a classical anti-Semitism that the professor talked about, of the Jewish people having some sort of inordinate Rasputin-like ability to mesmerize and make governments go in a direction that they wouldn't otherwise go. So not something that Congresswoman Omar invented in 2012 or 13, but something that was invented millennia ago. She had further emails talking about the effect of money. It was all about the Benjamins, that this is why the cash is the reason that there is a pro-Israel majority in Congress, which again talks to ancient canards about using our influence and our ill-gotten gains in order to try to move forward an agenda. And then the last thing which created the biggest kerfuffle was when she accused Jews of dual loyalty. That the reason that America is supportive of Israel is because we as Jews have this inappropriate, ghastly loyalty to a foreign country, and we use our influence to inappropriately move America in a direction that's not in America's interest. So this, seeing her remarks in the context that I've just given them, in the context that you've heard, to me speaks to why it was so disappointing, not just her remarks, but disappointing the response of a lot of the political infrastructure in America. In this context where, to me, it seems like we should be given the benefit of the doubt to express ourselves as to what is hateful to us, what is hurtful to us, that a lot of people tried to take that agency away from us and to sort of rest it on this idea that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism, which wasn't what is hurting of us. People can criticize, and I know we'll talk about this later, people criticize Israel for all sorts of reasons. If you were to turn your phone on right now and look at the Jerusalem Post or Haaretz, you'll see lots of criticism. Israeli newspapers, you'll see lots of criticism of Israel. If you come to my Shabbat table, you'll see criticism of Israel. If you go anywhere in Israel, there's criticism of Israel. There's a difference, though, between criticizing Israel and going out of bounds and using these anti-Semitic canards and these anti-Semitic stories as the hook to be critical of Israel and therefore critical of Jews. And I would just lastly say in this whole context that as far as those who have said in the context of Congresswoman Omar's statements, and the part that tells me that we as a JCRC and AJC communities need to do more is that the people who were forgiving her and rushing over those comments are people that we've known for decades, people who've been to our Shabbat tables, people who've been with us at synagogue, people who've been with us at celebrations. And for them not to recognize how hurtful these issues are to us deeply as Jews is really our failure as a community to communicate the real anti-Semitism 101, what it looks like. The dual loyalty canard, again, was not invented in 1967 or 1948. We've just come off the holiday of Purim, which is a celebration of Jewish survival in ancient Persia 3,000 years ago. And in that story, Mordecai, one of the heroes of the story, is also accused of dual loyalty. This is something that as we commune with our brothers and sisters outside the Jewish community, we need to do a better job of ensuring that you understand where we're coming from and how hurtful this is to us, and that together we can work to move these mountains. So thank you.
From the time that it's going to be hard to get to a lot of questions, but if you have questions and really feel they're important, write them on the card now, and we'll hopefully try to get to some of them. And then I'm going to ask our speakers if we can maybe try to be as direct in my response to my questions. We can try to cover as much ground as possible. I'm going to start with a question, and I'm throwing a curveball to them because it wasn't on any kind of prepared questions. And I'm wondering if there are people out here who are thinking to themselves, I watch the TV, and I see that 5 out of the standing committees in Congress are chaired by Jewish members. That if you count up the number of people who are in Congress, in the Senate, and the House nationally, that the number of Jews who are there outpaces the number ratio of the population. What would you say to someone who might be thinking, how can we be talking about anti-Semitism in a country where this is the reality, where Jews seem to be so prominent in so many ways and in positions of what you would call privilege? How does that jive together with what we've been talking about this morning, which is, and it's a real feeling, of being under assault? Maybe each of you could take a crack at that. And forgive me for throwing an unprepared question, but it may make it actually a little more here now.
It's not on the list.
Yeah.
I'll start, and I think just given my background expertise is abroad, and I know we can have Jews in parliament in other countries too with the same questions. But maybe I'll let Roland of the committees in Congress. But it is interesting. So when I ask my students, how many Jews do you, I teach an undergraduate college, Christian college actually in Santa Barbara, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? Percentage, like just how many? And 10%. I got a random 20%. And that's actually in Europeans will sometimes say 20%. Well, Jews make up less than 1/5 of 1% of the world population. It's a very small number. In the United States, it's 2%. And yet Jews every year, and the FBI reporting has shown that they receive the most hate crime. 58% of all religiously motivated hate crimes have been 16% from last week. Not even 2%. So there is something there, and I think when you can point to the fact that it is not necessarily about power. It's a lot of the left, the argument that we hear on the left is that Jews are white. And you're looking at the oppression and non-white, and you can't, how can you have a victim group that is white? And in my office in Los Angeles, I will say that there's only one person who's Jewish with Ashkenazi background, they're Dr. Sephardic, and they identify as brown Jews. They have a fascinating story about intersectionality and that topic. But what I usually say to students is that Jews, because they've been persecuted for a long time, have had to certain things that they've culturally valued, and education, and success and promoting himself and protecting others is really one of them. And it's actually something to be, embodied and to be emulated in they've reached this point. Areas of power, I guess, if you will, because of those values. And two pieces on this. The first is that we have another issue of philo-semitism. We see this in South Korea, which is really interesting. If you follow the ADL survey of most anti-Semitic countries based on their questions, South Korea is like at 56% anti-Semitic. There's no Jews in South Korea. You know what it is? They have copies of the Talmud, like above their fireplace. They want to emulate. They see, and not nothing is a good thing. Their religion actually says philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism are opposite sides of the same coin. Right, but it is this idea that sorry, is this better?
Yes.
I'm too busy. The same coin. The second piece, though, wanting to be emulated. But the second piece is in Europe, and we see this when we're trying to figure out ways of Holocaust education, that there's not an understanding of Jewish contribution to European society, Jewish history in European society, that Jews are very much part and parcel of what it means to be European, and all they know is the Holocaust and then now Israel. And so when we talk about education and we get to that point of, like, this is important to them, this is why they're invested in the community, this is why they're running for Congress, this is why they're lawyers, this is why they're involved, is because of these values and this long history of being persecuted, and after emancipation being finally able to have these jobs, which they didn't have in the Middle Ages. That's a huge part of the story, and we can't just look at what we see now. Sorry about the dual mic.
Do I need to use I need to use this also. Okay. I was in Atlanta last week, and the sound guy asked me if I should use a lavalier or a handheld, and I said, I think I'm going to do a Phil Donahue. And the guy looked at me like he had no idea what I was talking about. It's another age thing for those of us who, if you don't know who Phil Donahue is, Google him. So it's a really great question, to bring it back to the question. Certainly on a lot of levels, the Jewish community in America today is as free as Jews have ever been in our history. And that's something we should take note of. There was a time in this very city, 100 or so years ago, and less, where there were neighborhoods that Jews could not live in. There were professions that Jews could not practice. Jewish hospital here was formed because Jewish doctors couldn't get privileges at the non-Jewish hospitals. I'm sure there's a Jewish law firm or two that were formed here, as there were in Cleveland and cities all over the country, because lawyers couldn't work in non-Jewish firms. Across the board, we've come a long, long way as far as the sort of formal, institutional, legal discrimination. But much like many other parts of the progress that's been made as it relates to other communities, the African American community, the Latino community, and others, where many of these sort of formal legal restrictions are no longer there are these informal sets of anti-Semitism. The canards we're hearing about, the discrimination, the violence that takes place. And so while I think across the board in society, progress is an arc, we made moves forward and moves backward. Clearly there's room to grow here, and room where we can try to instill on individual behavior and on sort of a better mindset within society to combat anti-Semitism at every step.
So I'm going to go now right to the question. You can hear me all right?
No. In the back of the room, does Dr. Zola need a microphone?
Microphone.
It's highly unusual for Zola, but okay. First of all, I'm looking at the questions that have been passed up. I'm going to go right to them because we want to get as many as we can. And I'm going to tell you, for example, someone asked a question that we're not going to answer because if this is a question can be dealt with in the afternoon session, where the question is, how can someone be, especially a non-Jew, be critical of the state of Israel but not yet be called anti-Semitic? So we're dodging that, but we're going to talk about that this afternoon. Another question that maybe some of you might be able to get answered during the lunch break, if you take it, don't miss the opportunity to see our Holocaust and Humanities Center. There's a question a little bit about what the level of learning about the Holocaust is in Europe in comparison to here. But here's a question. Really, it was directed to you, William. Says you spent some time in your presentation speaking about Representative Omar's anti-Semitic remarks. Could you comment on the same kind of genre of remarks that were just made by the President of the United States last week in Las Vegas when talking to the Republican Jewish coalition? It seems that the Jewish community is not vocal enough in its condemnation of that kind of speech that we heard from the President and also from the Jewish response, conjuring up sort of the same kind of issues.
Thank you. So for those of you, I can give some background on the question. President Trump spoke on Saturday at the Republican Jewish Coalition annual meeting in Las Vegas. And at that meeting, during his speech, he about a dozen times used the wrong pronoun when talking about the relationship of people in the room to the state of Israel. So it's a room much like this, I presume probably the vast majority of our Americans, and he was talking about Netanyahu, and he would say, "Your prime minister." And he was talking about what the president has done in support of the state of Israel, and he would say in support of your country. Literally a dozen times. Contrary to what the questioner wrote, both the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League, a number of other organizations did come out and condemn the way that the president constructed that. It's not the first time he has done that. In 2015, just as he was starting to run, before the very same group, he made a similar sort of, actually it was worse. Not that I want to rate these things, but it was talking about how people in the room, it'd be a tough room to make a deal with the people in the room, right? Making sort of harkening back to our wily and dishonest negotiating tactics that is an anti-Semitic canard of many centuries. So the Jewish community was focused on that. I'll note, though, that I meet with a lot of members of Congress, and I will tell you that probably 4 or 5 times a year, I'll be with a member of Congress from not a place where there are a lot of Jews, from the middle of the country or the South or the West, and they'll make similar sort of remarks. I think mostly innocently, just not really understanding the nuance that we within the Jewish community get, and hopefully that you get, about the differences, where they'll say, "I was so happy to vote for the military aid for your country." Now, would they say that to an Irish person who, when they voted for the Irish military aid? I doubt it. But it's out there, and it's something, again, that I think points to our need to educate and to explain the differences here and the clarity. And I will say, in the same context, that for Republicans to say, Omar, 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 and Democrats to respond, Charlottesville, Charlottesville, Charlottesville. For Republicans then to say Omar, 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 and Democrats to say Charlottesville, 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 does not move the ball forward at all. And we need to work very, very hard to ensure that every other wedge issue that's out there, you name it, turn on Fox News or MSNBC and you get a taste of it, that anti-Semitism, that these issues involving the Jewish community don't become yet another part of this political food fight. And so I would say a pox on all of their houses. Let's move forward, period.
I'll just add one thing, and it's related to, especially a European context. It's becoming increasingly challenging when you have, for instance, Prime Minister Netanyahu a couple years ago, in speech to a European audience said, Israel is your home. Or he will self-identify as the prime minister for all of the Jewish people. That creates problems when you're already having Jews in Europe who, when they try to report anti-Semitism to the police will say, well, go back to Israel or you're not a citizen. And they've been there for such a long time. So it's a huge problem. I was at a security briefing again in Brussels, and Israel they have a whole ministry of actually working with the diaspora and helping them on security affairs. And they sent these two security guys to do a briefing for Belgian Jews on how to protect themselves. And at the end of the briefing, they said, come home. And it was, they actually, to be honest, really are very frustrated with this idea. And some do make aliyah, and they do go, they take anti-Semitism, but it's frustrating when they're trying to present themselves as a faithful, not a dual loyal citizen, but a faithful citizen of Belgium and France and Germany, and from the outside they're perceived as this connection with Israel. I'll touch briefly actually on the Holocaust education piece that was referenced, and I'll be very brief. Holocaust education in Europe needs to change. There's a new demographic of young people in Europe who have no connection to the Holocaust. And we're having instances where some of these students, most of them are from an immigrant and even again, in a Muslim background. It's nothing against Islam, it's just they don't have a connection to what happened in Europe. Parents, they often see it unfortunately through this Israeli propaganda lens, and parents aren't sending their children to school when the Holocaust is taught. We had incidents in Amsterdam where rocks were thrown at a teacher when she was trying to teach about the Shoah. Something that needs to be done, and it's beginning, it's in its infancy stages, and something I'm working on because I worked on Jewish-Muslim relations in Poland, is looking at Muslim rescuers of Jews, of Muslim righteous among the nations, of Muslims who saved Jews, and Jews who pretended to be their Muslim neighbors and survived the Holocaust. This is a story that happened in Poland, of course, happened in North Africa, it happened in the former Yugoslavia. This is a human story. And so we're just beginning to get there. And I'm happy to talk to whoever asked that question at lunch.
Well, it looks as though we have maybe time for just one more question. And, speaking as an American Jewish historian, one of the it's almost axiomatic in our field is the phrase that America has been an exception in all of diaspora history. That there are many reasons for this. This is the only diaspora where Jews were present in community before the Republic came into existence. This is the only diaspora community where Jews literally fought in the war to create the nation. Then there's the Constitution and its unique features, the separation of church and state, so that government, theoretically, and religion are not tied. And there are other important points that could be made. It should be made that none of that would matter without an independent judiciary. So the question that we'll conclude with, hear your comments on, is that strong enough to continue the trajectory? Dr. King said, the moral arc bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. It takes a long time. Are we still going to be bending in that direction based on your assessment of the here and now?
Thanks for that light closing there. It's a great question. I am, at the end of the day, I'm an optimist on a number of levels. I'm an optimist about America. I know we've had ups and downs and steps forward and steps backward, and that our institutions have been strong enough to survive and to thrive. And I think while we're in the midst of a storm, it's sometimes difficult to see where we've come from and where we're going, and we won't know it until the storm is over or abates a bit. But I'm confident, and I think that as we see some of the unpleasantness happening in America today, we see that there are checks on that. That there is a judiciary, that there are members of Congress who have that check and balance ability, and who are taking advantage of it. I think that as a Jewish community, I think to survive and thrive, we have to be optimists. I think if we weren't optimists, we never would have left Egypt. If we weren't optimists, we never would have left the shtetl in Eastern Europe, Eastern Central Europe. If we weren't optimists, never would have left the Lower East Side of New York. Although Cincinnati was, you guys were pretty early, the foundation here. But I think that to survive and thrive, we have to look forward. We have to see that the environment is one that we as Jews can help to engage to make our situation and the country as a whole a better one. And I think speaking to the beautiful preface you put about our place here at the founding, we as a Jewish community, we have a deep set of values and sort of a genetic predisposition to be engaged in the civic arena and to try to make the world a better place, to tune along. And I think that that continues to be our role, and we look forward to working. I look forward to working with allies across the board to move us further as a Jewish community and as an American community.
I'm also an optimist. I have anti-Semitism Google alerts on my phone that comes to me once a day, so I have to be an optimist, I think, in this space. I realize I didn't even talk about the successes that we're seeing, and I'm not going to now, don't worry, but there's so many incredible stories of Jewish, not just survival, but thriving. You look at the island of Jerba in Tunisia, and you've got young Jews being born into a community, in the Arab world, and it's just incredible. So again, it's not all downhill. I'm definitely an optimist, and I think Martin Luther King also said that we have to learn to live together as brothers or die together as fools. And this is where I want to kind of turn the Jewish community as such an emblem of what it means to be part of civil society, to fight for your rights and your freedoms, and to be involved and to contribute to American democracy. But it's also about coalition building, working across the aisle, political aisle, across religions, different sectors. And I'll close with a story which might be one of my most powerful examples of optimism, actually working together. So in the office that I worked in, Special Envoy's Office to Modern and Combat Anti-Semitism, we also had other envoys and representatives to different faith communities. And I worked right next door to the Special Representative to the Muslim community. And he traveled with the Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism to the Middle East. They went to Israel, they went to Palestinian Authority. And they met with the, and I can say this now because it's a different administration, but the Palestinian Authority education minister about anti-Semitism that was found on the school's website. Ira Foreman, who was the former special envoy, he was telling the Palestinian Authority education minister, please take this down, this is anti-Semitic, but really wasn't budging, like the man wasn't budging. And the special representative to the Muslim communities came in and said, let me explain this, and coming from a point of Islam, and Islam teaches to love each other, and that the Jews are the people of the book, and this is not okay, and this is why, and expelled it out. And the tone changed, completely changed. And all of a sudden you have this Palestinian Authority, education minister saying, actually, you're right, I can see it now. We'll work to get this off the website. And so you have a Muslim combating anti-Semitism, and on many occasions, as my boss was Jewish, he combated Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment. It's so much more powerful, because it's one thing to fight for your own people, it's another thing to fight for someone else. And we saw this, in Pittsburgh. There were so many Muslims that were at Shabbat service the next week. We saw this just recently, a few weeks ago, in Christ Church, Jewish communities donating to Christ Church, the synagogue, the Shabbat service, they closed the service on Saturday because in respect for their Muslim brothers. That's where the solution is, and I think that's why I'm still an optimist. So.
It's my unhappy duty to have to wrap this up, and I say that because I think it was a very fruitful conversation, and that there's always more to say. For those of you who wanted us to bear down with more focus on how we talk about Israel and offer criticism of Israel, and yet not be dealing in the topic of anti-Semitism, there is a session this afternoon, so that's where you'd want to be. I also, I think it's fair to say to our guests who are visiting us, as I look out on the audience, your observation, William, is true. I see so many friends from around the community that we have already worked so hard together in the very direction that you've spoken. And that's one of the most uplifting parts of being in this room together today. And I think we all know from history, there's no doubt about it, that it's been said in many other ways. Somebody said today that antisemitism historically is not the end, it's the beginning of tragedy for humankind. It's always been proven. Once that unfolds, it's just a matter of time until others continue to suffer. So I think you in the audience want to join me again in thanking our speakers.